Welcome back to another tutorial. Today we are going to recreate Ducky by Aditya PK18. This is a physics platformer kind of game where you play as this yellow duck and your goal is to get to the goal. You drag along the screen to control the trajectory of your guy and letting go launches it. As soon as it comes in contact with any surface, the duck will just stick in that spot and make its nest. Aside from that, the game also features spikes to destroy the play when touched, enemies that slide between 2 points, and keys that we can collect to unlock gates. This seems like a fun project to work on, so without further ado, let's begin. So first things first, let me address all the assets we'll be using for the game. Here we have the player. Notice that it has a slightly smaller size in the full block so that A, we can skip the part where we unglue the sides, and B, so that it can travel through tight areas without colliding too much with its surroundings. It also has a box collider. Next in our list is the gold block, unglued in all sides and has a box collider. Then we have the spikes. Again, unglued and has a box collider. We have 4 variations to cover all directions. After that, we have the enemy. Notice that the pupil is disconnected from the character itself since we'll be adjusting its position separately. Let me also just quickly unglue the sides completely. This block has a box collider. Next, we have the key, which actually has no collider. Then, for the gate, it is unglued in all sides and has a box collider. Finally, we have all of these blocks in decor to help us construct our levels. The first thing we're going to do is to assign the player and the gold block to their respective variables. Afterwards, let's get rid of all of these blocks and create our example level. We are going to have 2 layers for the level, as the bottom layer will be used for decor and other background elements. Then, let's place our player and the gold block into the scene. Let's create a script block to hold all of our code. And the first bit of scripting we'll put inside is all about the camera. Use a getSize block, add both inputs and scale it by half to get a center. Then for the distance, what we'll do instead is get the true size of the world by subtracting its max by its min, fetch the high value and multiply it by 5, as well as add another value of 5. Next, let's set up the camera with our variables. For the rotation, keep it at 90 in the x-axis to get a top-down view. Let's also adjust the shadows. When we press play, we can see that it works. If we bring some block far away from the actual level, look at how their distance from the screen edges is roughly similar. And if we bring another block and move it at the top, it takes the one with a greater distance, which is at the x-axis, and therefore the distance stayed the same. If we did the usual distance then multiply by some number bit, notice how it outputs a much bigger result. Now, seeing that in a way this is a physics-based game, we need to implement some gravity into our level. And for that, we would need this block called setGravity. This allows us to control the direction and strength of the world gravity. By default, every level has a gravity of -9.8 in the y-axis, just like in a world. This really only affects how physics objects fall. If we set the gravity to be -9.8 in the z-axis and change our play to be physical, look at how the duck drops down to the ground. And if we just play around with the values, notice how that influences the player's gravity. Let's set this back to be normal. At the start of the game, let's introduce a new boolean moving, which tells us if the player is currently, well, moving. Let's also restrict the player's Y movement and lock its rotation. Then, let's set up the controls. We begin by creating a logic gate to enable them. We want it to be turned on if the game hasn't stopped and if the player is currently not moving. So let's plug an OR block before inverting its value. So if any of these becomes true, the whole thing becomes true, which then gets negated to be false. While this is active, let's attach a touch sensor, set the begins, and save the starting touch position to a variable and set the boolean drag to true, which tells us that the player is currently dragging the screen. While this is true, we connect another touch sensor, set the touching, and save the current touch position. Also, there's a reason why we want to run the sensor only if the player is dragging. Let's say that the duck is currently moving, and we want to hold into the screen. Right now it doesn't do anything since we've disabled the controls. But as soon as the duck lands, the first touch sensor wouldn't do anything as it only checks for input at the start of the touch. But the second touch will, as it continuously checks as long as we are touching the screen. We shouldn't proceed to the rest of the code as we are missing data from the starting touch position. Thus, the reason why we have a boolean so that this touch sensor only runs if the first one did. We then check if the player intends to move the duck. We do that by getting the difference between the two variables, finding its magnitude by fetching the distance between that vector and the origin, and checking if the value is greater than 0. Let's test if it works, and as soon as we move our finger, we trigger a noise. Using our vector variables, we can determine the velocity we'll use to launch our player. Let's talk about the logic behind how this will work. We first need to get the difference between the start and current touch position. After that, we normalize that vector to have a consistent length. So regardless of how long that offset could be, we convert it into a direction with a magnitude of 1. Then, we scale it based on the distance between the two variables, but doing so actually just gets us right back where we started. So, what's the catch? What if we get the lower value between the distance and some number and use it as a scale? Think of it as a circle with that specific number as its radius. If we pick the point that is within that circle, its distance from the center is less than the radius, so nothing would have changed. However, if we move this point to be further away, its distance becomes longer than the radius and therefore we have to clamp it right at the circumference. What we are essentially doing is setting up a maximum value for velocity, locking it down to this circle. Now, let's place the code. We can also multiply this value to increase the velocity strength, and if we check this vector's values, you can see how there seems to be a maximum length of 15 for our velocity. We can now define the velocity for a duck, but it's pretty hard to predict where it will land. Therefore, it's important to create a way to demonstrate the bird's trajectory so that the player has an idea of where their character can end up at. So, if I drag here, the bird should float up before it descends to a point, and if I drag down, it should just jump in place. How are we going to do this? Well, let's talk about quadratic equations. It is a kind of equation that can be arranged in the form ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0, where ax squared is the leading coefficient as it is the one with the highest exponent, bx is the linear coefficient, and c is the constant coefficient. Another definition of this is that it is an equation that has 2 as its highest exponent, also known as the degree. You don't need to know too much about it, but when we graph a quadratic equation, it will always form this U-shaped curve, though that orientation depends on the sign of the first term. This shape is what we call a parabola. If we visualize the path of an object thrown into the air, notice how the curve it takes is similar to a parabola. It goes up and once it reaches a certain point, it falls back down due to gravity. Therefore, using parabolas is a great way to simulate the motion of physical objects, such as our player. Also, I should mention that if you simply want the block that draws the parabola and skip this entire process, then you can just search for it. Actually made by the same guy who created this game, believe it or not. But anyways, let's create a brand new level solely for coding this thing. We will first be demonstrating this trajectory using raycast. We begin by bringing this ball, saving its position, and restricting its movement and rotation. We'll set our gravity to be negative 9.8, which we'll also define as the acceleration. Bring in another ball here, and notice how that plunges down while the other one isn't as it is currently locked. Set the number of points in our curve to be 30, and have some vector as initial velocity. Break that vector to get our x and z directions, then create a loop for all the points. Usually when we graph something, we consider y to be a function of x, as we use x values to get y values. However, in our case, writing something in the form y is equal to f of x is a lot more difficult because we don't really know what x is either. Instead, we'll be using another parameter to determine our x and y positions. These kinds of equations are what we call parametric equations. In most cases, we typically consider time to be that parameter, which we denote as t. Using parametric equations allows us to determine the path or position of an object in any given time. For the x value, we'll simply be multiplying time with our x velocity. For the y value, however, there's a lot more to factor in. I am so sorry in advance, but this next part is going to get really mathematical. If you don't really want to hear me explain how we'll get the y position and instead just want the formula, here you go. But if you're curious to know how we get to this point, let me elaborate. This graph right here is an example of a velocity time graph. It outlines the velocity of an object at a given time. Velocity is plotted on the vertical axis and the time is plotted on the horizontal axis. The gradient or the steepness of this line describes its acceleration. If the line just stays at 0, that means the object is at rest. If it's greater than 0 and it's a horizontal line, that means the object is moving at constant velocity. If that line has a slope, that means the object is speeding up or slowing down with constant acceleration. The area under the curve is the total displacement of the object, aka the distance traveled. Now, let's talk about the variables. So we have s for displacement, u is for initial velocity or the velocity at time equals 0, v is for final velocity or the velocity at t seconds, a is for acceleration, which in this case is the gravity, and t is for time. The gradient of this line, or the acceleration, can be retrieved by finding the difference in the velocity divided by the difference in time. That means we'll be subtracting the final velocity with the initial velocity and the time with 0, leaving us with a is equal to v minus u over t. For the area under the graph, or the displacement, there are two ways of getting it. Number 1, we treat the shape as a combination of a right triangle and a rectangle. To get the area of a rectangle, we multiply its length by its width. For the right triangle, however, notice how a rectangle can be seen as a shape made up of two right triangles, split up at the diagonal. That means the area of a right triangle is just half the area of a rectangle. More specifically, it is going to be the base times height divided by 2. So for the rectangle, it is going to be u multiplied by t. For the triangle, it is v minus u times t all over 2. Now let's find the sum of these two areas. Let's expand the area of a triangle and get rid of all of these brackets. Then we have a common factor of t, so we can put that outside. U minus 1/2 u is equal to 1/2 u, and now we can rewrite this as s is equal to u plus v over 2 times t. Number 2, think of it as a trapezium laid on its side. A trapezium, or a trapezoid, is a quadrilateral with only one pair of parallel sides. To get the area of a trapezium, we add the lengths of the two parallel sides, divided by 2, and multiply by the height. In our case, the two sides are u and v, and the height is t. Therefore, its area will also be s is equal to u plus v divided by 2 times t. Now, remember that we're looking for a y position, which in this case would be the displacement s. However, we have no idea what the final velocity is. Therefore, we need to eliminate it from our equation. But how? Going back to our acceleration formula, we can multiply both sides with t to get rid of the fraction. Then, we move u to the other side to isolate v, leaving us with v is equal to u plus at. We then use this to substitute for v for the displacement formula. So we have u plus at divided by 2 times t. We add the two u's and separate them so that we have 2u divided by 2 plus at divided by 2, all multiplied by t. 2u divided by 2 is just u, and if we carry this t to our terms, then we end up with ut plus 1/2 at squared. And that is the formula that we'll be using to get our y value. We'll be using I as a way to get the current and next points, which we need for the raycast. By connecting it like this, we will be running the script twice per iteration. For the parameter, we add the index with I and multiply it by how far away the points would be. For x, we multiply t with val x. For z, we multiply t with val z and increase it by the squared value of t, multiplied by the acceleration and scaled by 0.5. We then combine these values into a vector before saving it into a list. We use our starting position and offset it with a vector. Now for the raycast, it is important that you place it at the right side because of execution order. Basically, code runs left to right, top to bottom. We'll use our points to define the positions of the line and attach it to an if condition. If we move this ball slightly to the right and press play, we can visualize the trajectory it takes if it were to have that starting velocity. You can also change the number of points, the distance between them, and the initial velocity to see how our curve adjusts. Now let's add a touch sensor and bring out the set velocity block. This block instantaneously sets an object's velocity. It has 3 inputs. We have object, which is what we'll modify, we have velocity, which is the directional velocity, and we have spin, which is the angular velocity. Keep in mind of the word instantaneous. For example, if an object is falling and we apply this block, it will reset its velocity and use what we've set into our object. We first unlock the ball's movement and the x and z axis before we set its velocity. When we test this out, you can see our ball following the green curve. And if we mess around with the initial velocity, it will still work the same. Now it's time to put all of this inside the script block, and it will have 3 inputs. The before and afterwards to integrate with the rest of the code, the number of points to display, the gravity, the origin or the starting point, and the initial velocity. We'll set a boolean to true when this is running. I'll talk more about this later. Then let's set up some initial values for our variables before plugging them into the side of the block. On play, we loop to the length and create particles to save into a list. Next, let's attach our vector variables and rename our inputs. Let's get rid of this raycast and drag our code inside. At the end of this loop, we set that boolean back to false. Instead of raycasts, we'll be positioning our particles to where the points are. We'll also set the visibility based on that boolean. What this does is that in every frame we run this code, we also display the parabola. Once that stops running, the curve automatically hides itself. Now let's plug in our variables onto the script. When we press play, we can see our visualized trajectory. If I attach it to a touch sensor, take note of how it only shows up whenever I'm holding the screen. We could also change the particle's rotation to follow along. We can do that by getting the offset between the next point and the current one and converting it into a rotation. Let's go back to the main script and connect our parabola block here. Let's set the number of points to 20, the starting position to where the player is, and the initial velocity based on our val variable. And now we have a way of knowing the path of our duck. Next, it's time to actually move the duck. Add a touch sensor, set to ends, and when the player stops touching, check for the can boolean and set the drag boolean back to false. If this is true, then that means the player intends to launch the character. Therefore, we specify that the bird is moving. We'll also unlock the player's movement in the X and Z axis and set its velocity, finishing it off with an SFX. Now, if you drag across the screen and let go, we can launch the duck towards that direction. Create an if statement checking if the bird is not moving. If that's the case, then we would want to restrict its movement except for the y-axis and set the velocity back to 0 to make the play static. If not, then we set the play's rotation to 0, plug in a late update sensor, and update the rotation based on the duck's velocity. When we press play, you can see the character oriented towards where it's moving. If you recall in one of my tutorials, a late update sensor executes code once the physics have been processed. In our case, that's when we apply velocity to the player, how it collides with its environment, etc. The reason why we only change the rotation once the physics have been dealt with is so that we don't mess with its hitbox. If we were also turning the collider before the game processes the physics, then problems may arise with a collision. Speaking of which, let's take care of the collision right now. Check if the game hasn't stopped before attaching it to a late update sensor. Then we connect it to a collision block. Given an object, this block checks for any collision and returns related properties. Aside from the before var, we only have one input here, which is the first object, or the object that we are checking the collision for. For its outputs, we have the following. We have collided, which runs if it has collided with another object. We have the second object, which is the object that the input object collides with. We have the impulse, which is the impact force or how hard the collision is. And we have the normal, which is the direction of the impact from the second object to the first object. We'll check the collision for our player, and once it happens, we keep track of the object it collides with and the normal direction. Check if the player is moving. If so, then set it back to false. We then change the player's rotation based on the normal and add a hit SFX. When we test this, the duck now sticks to where it lands and it turns perpendicular to the wall. Now let's add a truth variable set to false, have an if condition that we'll build upon later, and check if that boolean is still false. The idea is that we want to do different things based on what object the player collides with and set that boolean to true. If that boolean remained false, then that probably means that the duck just collided with a regular surface. If so, then let's create some particles to indicate impact towards the contact point. The idea is to generate a random amount of particles and position them to where the player collides with a surface. We then use the normal direction to know how those particles deviate from their starting position. So for example, if the duck is falling onto the ground, the normal will be pointing up because that is the offset of the bird from the surface. We then rotate the direction by 90 degrees and scale it by some randomized value to disperse the particles. After a while, we erase them. To get the contact point, we subtract the player's position with a normal scaled by 0.5 and add an offset of 0.5 in the y-axis so that it doesn't get buried under the ground. Then have a loop that runs a random amount of times. Now when we create the particles, we'll save them into a list. The more the player collides with the surface, the bigger this list becomes. This doesn't have to be that way because all these particles disappear anyway, meaning it just becomes a bloated list with empty slots. Therefore, it is a good practice to reuse these cells instead of creating new slots. I've actually talked about this in a previous tutorial, so here's an excerpt from that video. Whenever we try to spawn an object, we'll first look through the list and see if there are any open spots. At the start, there won't be any because there's no list, so we'll append this object and update the list length. At the second try, since the first item still holds an object, we do the same thing. Insert it at the end and update. At the third try, same thing, first two items are occupied, you know the drill. But let's say the first particle has ran its course and gets removed. Now, when we spawn an object, instead of bringing it to the end, we can simply take the place of the first spot as it is currently empty. That is essentially the logic behind the system. Loop through the list, override items if available, and append if necessary. That way, we won't have a list length that is ever increasing, as after a while, all of the created particles will be continually sorted in the same boxes and therefore that value stagnates. So, create a script block. Inside the script, we set a number to 0 and check if it is less than the list length. If this is false, then that means we haven't found anything, so we take that list length as the found index and increase it, before connecting the executor to the side of the block. We also plug the found index outside. While the loop is active, we check if the list item with the number value is empty. If it isn't, then we increase the number and loop back. If it is, however, then we specify that to be the found index. Let's rename these Y's. Then we plug it into the loop, with PS as the list and PSLen as the length. We take note of the index, create a copy of the particle, store it into the list using the index, and position it based on the vector variable. When we press play, you can see a white square appearing at the contact point. Further go position. We'll be using the vector as a starting point and add an offset based on the normal rotated by 90, before scaling it with a random value between -1 and 1. Then, for its lifetime, we'll have a random value between 15 and 28, specifically 28. Then, create a loop for the particles. Check if the object still exists. If it does, then check if the lifetime is less than 0. If not, then we decrement it. We'll also update the particle's position by taking its current position and adding it with a difference between that and the goal point and scaling it with some number. Once this condition becomes true, then we delete the object. Let's see if this works, and it does. We create particles that run alongside the surface that disappears after a short amount of time. Afterwards, let's set up our win condition. Going back to the collision script, we check if the hit object is the same as the goal block. Let's also run this even if the player isn't moving. If that's the case, then we stop the game, have some sounds, and attach a win block with a delay of 30 frames so that the particles disappear before the game takes a screenshot and leads the player to the win screen. Let's also set the boolean to true to avoid creating particles. And when we press play, we can now win the game. Then it's time for the spikes. I'm going to create a sample level that includes them. Now we don't want our player to collide with the spikes because doing so should trigger our lose condition. So let's take all of our spike variations and store them in a list before incrementing the length. After that, let's go back to the collision script and loop through all of the spikes. We then check if the hit object matches with one of those items. Let's play a noise if it does, and it does. If that's the case, we stop the game, get some clang, add a loose block with a 30 frame delay, hide the player, and set the boolean to true. Next, Let's add some particles that extend outward in a circular shape like a pop effect. Have a loop that runs 8 times. Look for any open spots in the list. Create a particle and save it into a list. Position it to where the player was. And use it as the starter position for the goal with an offset of a rotated vector based on the loop index. We multiply it by 45 to cover 360 degrees. For the lifetime, we set it to be 28. And now, the dog pops out of existence as soon as it touches the spike. After that, let's start coding the enemies that slide back and forth. We begin by creating a sample level to showcase these red guys. Okay, so just a quick heads up, all the code within this section of this tutorial will mostly be replaced later. It does work, don't get me wrong, and you can totally just stick with the code, but the behavior placed onto our enemies is wildly different from the ones in the original game. At some point later, I would have realized that. But until then, here you go. Let's talk about the logic that goes into the enemies. An enemy block will have 3 properties: the destination point it travels to, the movement speed, and the direction boolean. At the start of the game, we keep track of the enemy's 2 points. Call them A and B. A is where the enemy originally is, and B is the destination point. The direction boolean tells us if the enemy should go from A to B or vice versa. Then we check if the distance from its position and the goal point is less than a certain number. If it isn't, then we use our movement speed to navigate the enemy to its location. Once it's below the threshold, we negate the boolean to have it go the other way. I'm going to create a custom script block out of this particle solely as a reference for our enemy, for which we will be hiding. Open the block and other properties. We'll also save the eye into its own list. We'll set a default value of 0.04 for the speed. And increment the list length. Then loop to the enemies. Keep track of our index, object, and speed with variables. On play, save the positions to our 2 destination points. Next, we'll determine the goal point based on our direction boolean. If this is false, then the enemy has to go to point B. Otherwise, it has to go to point A. Then, let's have an if condition that just returns true purely for redirecting our code. Here, we check if the distance between the current and goal position is less than the movement speed. If not, then we update its location by adding onto the block's position with a normalized offset between the 2 vectors scaled by the speed. This allows the enemy to gradually move towards the destination. Once it has reached its stop, then we use a not operator to invert that boolean. When we press play, you can see how the enemy slides back and forth between the 2 points. Going back to the collision script, we simply have to duplicate this code and replace the variable names for the enemies. Now we can lose the game if we collide with one of them. There's a reason why we didn't restrict the Y position when a player is not moving. That is because without it, the enemy wouldn't be able to collide with the duck, as at that point, it is completely static and treated as a non-physical object. Now, let's make the eye follow the player. We do this by getting the offset between the enemy and player's position and converting it into a rotation. We then set the position of the eye based on the enemy's position, added by a rotated vector using our variable. Now, the enemy is locked in as it gazes to our player. Then, let's implement the keys and gates. I'm going to create another level to demonstrate this mechanic. We want to be able to grab and collect the keys so that we can unlock the gates. First, let's store them into the respective lists. Next, let's create a loop for the keys. At the start of the game, we save the key's initial position. Then, we'll move the object based on that vector with some offset. That offset should give movement for the key to bob up and down. From here, we take the current frame block and add a multiple of 20 based on the loop index. This is done so that the keys don't all float the same. Then, we scale it to determine the movement speed. We then use a sign block to produce a value that goes between -1 and 1. Finally, we scale it with the magnitude of the movement. When we press play, the keys are now hovering. Next, let's add a boolean that checks if the key has been collected. If not, then we inspect the distance between the object and the player and see if it's less than a certain number. If so, then we set that boolean to true, hide the key, include some sounds, and increase the number of keys. If we quickly check its value in playtest, notice how that number goes up every time we acquire a key. Then, let's copy this pop particle script and place it here, replacing the variable with the object. Now we also have some particle action going. After that, let's work on the gates. Have another loop, keeping track of the index and the object. Then, let's have a boolean that checks if the gate has been unlocked. If not, then we check if the distance between the object and the player is less than a certain number. Aside from that, we'll also see if the number of keys is greater than 0, indicating that the player has at least one key. If both of these conditions are true, then we unlock the gate. Hide the object, add some audio, decrease the number of keys, and direct it to the particle script. Let me just quickly fix this. And now, we can open the gates by using our keys. Okay, so I was just about to look for a level design that I can replicate for the outro of this video, but apparently, I done goofed up. As you can see, the enemies bump off each other as they collide. There is nothing necessarily wrong with our script, but if we were to place two enemies side by side, they will just face to each other. So, let's go fix it on the fly. We start off by removing the destination points because that is not what we need anymore. We can also just delete everything here except for the code to move the eye. Let's update the properties our enemy will have. We can just get rid of this object variable and replace it with a boolean that checks if the enemies move vertically or horizontally. We'll also include a direction variable that determines if it should go one way or the other. In a way, this was the direction boolean earlier, only converted into a number. The way we'll be checking for collision is through the use of raycast. The idea is to start at the front of where the enemy is currently moving towards. Then go up and to the side. For the endpoint, it travels a full block to the other side and goes down. We also do this vice versa to check for both sides. If any of these rays hit something, then we tell the enemy to do a U-turn. First, let's inspect the boolean to see if the enemy is going up and down or side to side. We'll be using a rotation to adjust the direction of the raycast, and since our default value pertains that the block is moving horizontally, we'll have a rotation of 0 if false, and a rotation of -90 in the y-axis if true. Then, we set a truth variable to false, and create some wire splits to define the start and end points of the raycast in both cases before checking that same boolean. For the point A, we stem from the enemy's position and add a rotated vector using our variable. Let's plug them into a raycast just to see if it works. Move this to the side, we can see a line protruding out of the enemy. Now let's say that this moves vertically. Now it points downwards, though let's change the rotation to have it go up. Now let's get rid of this position and replace it with A and B. Let's update this vector to be 0.51 so that it just peaks outside the block. Then we scale it with the enemy's direction to determine if it should go one way or the other. Then we add it with some vector to move it up and to the side, which we define here. We don't need to change the Y position, we just have to invert Z. Then for B, we rotate the other vector with a rotation. Again, we want it to go down and to the other side. Let's have an OR operator, so that if this becomes true, then the entire thing becomes true. I'll also fix the endpoint so that this branches off A. If this boolean is false, then we update the enemy's position with a rotated vector. That vector is going to be scaled by the enemy's speed to define how fast it should move. as well as the enemy direction to determine which way to go. Now, the guy slides to the right until it hits a wall. If this is true, then we negate the direction. Now, the enemy moves to the other side once it collides with something, and if we mess around with the speed and direction, you can see that it still works fine. You can even add more than one enemy and watch them bump off each other. We have successfully created a template for this Ducky game. Now, it's your turn to design your own levels and make them fun and challenging. I hope you learned a lot with this tutorial. As always, there is a GitHub link in the description containing the code screenshots, as well as a glossary for all the variables used in the video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.